The idea that the Mafia controls or has controlled the music business is rooted in a combination of historical connections, payola scandals, which we will discuss more in detail, and what I would describe as the cash-focused ambiguity of the entertainment business overall. In today's episode, we are deep diving into the roots of these three primary pillars, looking at their historical significance as well as their possible current-day relevance. So if I go missing after this episode, you all know why. I'm just kidding. Look at Courtney Love. There are three primary historical connections that tie the mob into the music scene. Number one, the mob's historical involvement in nightclubs and venues. Number two, the mob's connections to record label executives. And three, the mob's infiltration into artist management. First, let's discuss the mob's historical involvement in nightclubs and venues, and then we'll go into their connections with the record labels and artist management. Webster Hall has been pegged as the first nightclub venue to really operate in America. Webster Hall first opened its doors in 1886. This was at the peak of the influx of Irish immigrants to Ellis Island. Between 1880 and 1920, over 4 million Italians arrived in America, tens of thousands of them settling in New York City alone. Now, many of them settled into an area of 5 points called Mulberry Bend, which was one of the worst areas in Manhattan. And this is where the infamous 5 Points gang was founded by Paul Kelly in the 1890s. And this was ultimately the same gang that Al Capone was part of. I want to note how the Italians were settling here in Lower Manhattan because this ends up being just a 12-minute drive to Webster Hall, which was built at the northern edge of Little Germany at 125 East 11th Street. This was near Astor Place in the East Village of Manhattan. Webster Hall saw countless labor unions, rallies, political fundraisers, lectures, military functions, marches, strikes, and of course, weddings, concerts, and dance events. Even though Webster Hall was originally constructed with the intent of being used solely for music entertainment, since the hall was located in the midst of the German-born working class, this made it the perfect location for labor unions and other political organizations to gather. That also meant it was attracting a certain caliber of folks, including anarchists and socialists. But the hall started to undergo what many would describe as a cultural shift in the early 1900s. In 1913 specifically, the hall hosted a fundraiser for a socialist magazine called The Masses. This fundraiser obviously further attracted socialists, anarchists, and other counterculture people, one of which very well could have been, and many think did include, the famous mobster Paul Kelly. Now, 1913 was a powerful year for Paul Kelly. This was the year he was infamously involved with a political organization scandal with the Society of St. Tammany, which operated in a building referred to as Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall was located at 44 Union Square East in Union Square, Manhattan, which I have to mention was located literally right around the corner from Webster Hall. Tammany Hall was the main political machine for the Democratic Party. And when I say main political machine, I mean Tammany Hall was unjustly controlling everything relating to the Democratic Party in New York City, all the way down to controlling the elections. And behind all of the intimidation tactics used to control these elections was, you guessed it, Paul Kelly. Paul Kelly was operating in smaller gangs for a long time, and it wasn't until 1896 he formed the 5 Points gang by recruiting smaller street gangs to unite under his leadership. Now, the leaders at Tammany Hall realized that they could utilize Paul Kelly and his mobsters and make a deal with them. The deal was that they would face legal protection from their gang activities if in return the gang helped the leaders at Tammany Hall. The mob infamously would engage in vote-buying schemes, where they either paid voters or coerced voters into casting ballots for their preferred candidates. They also engaged in other election fraud techniques by stuffing ballot boxes, tampering with votes, and intimidating voters at polling stations. They further enforced political decisions in the favor of whoever Tammany Hall was representing by bribing or blackmailing politicians, judges, and law enforcement officials to ensure favorable decisions from them. The 5 Points gang also had politicians who were directly on their payroll and received regular payments from them in exchange for them passing legislation the Democratic Party wanted passed. And on top of all of these intimidating favors the mob was doing for the Democratic Democratic Party, they were also heavily contributing to members of the left and directly contributing financially to the Democratic Party as a whole and to Tammany Hall's operation specifically. All of that in exchange for immunity, for the ability for these gangs to continue their illegal activities without any repercussions. And so, of course, when this huge fundraiser takes place in 1913 at Webster Hall, you could say Webster Hall had officially been infiltrated by the mob, Tammany Hall, and other corrupt members of the Democratic Socialist Party. But the culture at Webster Hall was about to get a lot worse as the 1910s transitioned into the 1920s. And so was the culture in New York City as a whole, as Prohibition and the mob's involvement in the New York scene took over. On January 17th, 1920, it was officially illegal to manufacture, sell, or transport any kind of intoxicating liquor in the United States. And this was a problem for Paul Kelly and the Democratic Party and the mob. No, they didn't like this at all. You see, prior to 1920, the mob's primary sources of income were all from illegal activities that were often construed and agreed upon over alcoholic beverages. Many members of the Mafia owned or controlled saloons and bars and taverns and freely opened their doors to other mobsters to come in and have their open conversations and open exchanges. Now, if you were a local business who was not mob owned or operated and witnessed any illegal operations from these gang members, they'd threaten to vandalize your business. They'd threaten to inflict violence on you, the business owner, your patrons, or even your family. They also love to threaten arson and to just burn the whole place down, unless the business owner paid them a sum of money to prevent any of this from happening. And this extortion technique was one of the gang's primary sources of income: illegal gambling, operation of brothels, theft, robbery, and threatening union leaders in the same manner as they did to local businesses in labor racketeering, in addition to their political corruption and money received from the Democratic Party for all of their election fraud work and intimidating political opponents and that sort of a thing. All of that contributed to the gang's sources of income prior to Prohibition, but all of these dealings and kind of tactics were all kind of centrally focused around alcohol and bars and taverns. All of this contributed to the gang having an estimated wealth, by the way, of well over $10 million. So when Prohibition hit in 1920, the mob saw an enormous opportunity. They knew they had the political power and legal immunity to open speakeasies and control the manufacturing, selling, and transportation of alcohol without facing any legal implications due to their connections and deals with the Democratic Party elites and law enforcement. In the 1920s, these secret clubs started to pop up all over New York City. And some of them were not even so secret, but would have like a secret stash of wine or a secret wine cellar, secret place where they were keeping the alcohol. The Cotton Club in Harlem was central to what would become known as the Harlem Renaissance during this time. And the Cotton Club was controlled by an Irish-American mobster named Oni Madden. Oni used this club to sell bootlegged alcohol and to launder money. The Stork Club was owned by a guy named Sherman Billingsley. Sherman had a very close tie to the mob, and the mob infamously provided legal protection for the club while being the club's sole supplier of alcohol. Club 21 in Manhattan, also heavily protected by the Mafia. The El Fay in Manhattan was also a popular speakeasy in New York City, owned by Texas Gwynnon, who was connected to various organized crime members, and the Mafia, of course, supplied that club all of its alcohol and protection from law enforcement. The Silver Slipper in Manhattan. Not only was this club controlled by the mob, and not only did the Mafia supply all of the alcohol for this club as well, but they also frequented this one quite a bit. You could almost always find gangsters in the Silver Slipper, gambling, drinking, smoking, handling prostitution exchanges, or just talking general business. Now, while these are just a few, it is estimated that out of the possibly thousands of speakeasies that popped up in New York City in the 1920s, a substantial portion of them, well into the hundreds, were directly owned or heavily influenced by the Mafia. Everything from a small hole-in-the-wall hidden speakeasy to a more larger, more lavish nightclub that just had a secret door or a secret supply of alcohol that the mob was providing to them in exchange for, of course, protection from the law should they ever be busted. Now, if a nightclub owner didn't already have a direct connection to someone in the mob, then they'd pay the mafia in the black market for the mafia to supply to them and protect them. And Webster Hall was definitely partaking in this pie. Webster Hall started to expand its cultural initiative, I'll call it that, in the 1920s, and became more and more known for throwing very lavish masquerade balls and soirees. And these parties started to get more and more attention and also started to get more and more wild and risque as the 1920s went on. By the mid-1920s, Webster Hall was given the nickname the Devil's Playhouse because of its wild and risque events. And these types of events didn't just attract well-to-do flappers and their escorts, they also attracted celebrities, including F. Scott Fitzgerald and other notable men. And of course, everyone pretty much knew, I mean, if you put two and two together, that the mafia was 100% behind these parties and the illegal activities that were going on at these parties at Webster Hall. It didn't take a genius to figure out that Webster Hall was heavily engaged in the Democratic Party and Democrat elites, all of these very corrupt politicians who were directly connected with the mafia, who were supplying alcohol and protection from illegal activities. It just didn't take a genius to put that together. It was rumored that Al Capone himself could have owned Webster Hall for a period of time in the 1920s. Although he did have a main base of operations in Chicago, he maintained his connections with the mob in New York and did a lot of illegal alcohol trading there. Quite a bit. So with all of this supplying of alcohol to nightclubs, the mob is also guilty by association with a lot of the musicians and artists playing in these nightclubs. Especially if you are a mobster who owned the nightclub, then you were the one going out and hiring the acts to come play in your venue, and you had direct communication with them and direct contracts with them. Jazz was huge during this time. In fact, the 1920s are referred to as the jazz era, and these nightclub venues were also among the few places where African American jazz musicians could perform for an all-white or mixed audience. Having the opportunity to play in these nightclub venues in New York City in the 1920s meant everything to up-and-coming jazz artists. Of course, it also came with a lot of risk because you were playing in a place that was completely littered with illegal activities, albeit protected by the mob. But while these venues may be protected by the mafia, that didn't mean the artist was. So it was still risky to be in that scene at all. There was also a risk for the artist because they had very little to absolutely no say in their work conditions or pay, or what they could even play. Now, earlier I mentioned the Cotton Club in Harlem. One of the most notable figures in jazz, Duke Ellington, performed regularly at this club in the 1920s. Louis Armstrong was also from this era. Fats Waller, a jazz pianist and composer who was reportedly kidnapped by gangsters and forced to perform at a party, was also from this era, as was Bessie Smith, and many others who got their notoriety from playing these venues in the 20s. Now, Columbia Records saw the growing jazz scene in the 1920s and wanted to take advantage of it. Although Columbia Records was founded in 1887, they recorded some of the earliest jazz and blues music in the 1920s. While there's no direct link, of course, to Columbia Records and the mob, we can look at the timeline of the evolution of Columbia Records and their jazz music and make some observations. For one thing, Columbia Records was located at 55 Liberty Street in New York City. The building housed Columbia's corporate offices as well as its recording studios. And this was about 30 minutes from Tammany Hall and Webster Hall, and just 15 minutes from where the Five Points Gang was founded and had their primary operations hub. A man named Ted Wollaston held a lot of influence in Columbia's operations during the 1920s. He eventually became president in 1939, but in the 1920s, he was primarily responsible for the sales and marketing of Columbia Records. He played a crucial role in Columbia's market reach and the record label's ability to reach a wider audience. He was also networking a lot on the jazz scene and in these nightclubs. It was under Ted's leadership that several jazz artists were signed to the label in the 1920s, and also under his leadership that Columbia Records bought out OK Records in 1926, spelled O-K-E-H, which is arguably when the growing control the mafia supposedly had or has over the music industry really amped up because many of the artists who were playing gigs in these Mafia-owned nightclubs had been signed and had been recording at OK Records. Most notably, Louis Armstrong, who played at the Cotton Club in Harlem, King Oliver, Clarence Williams, Bessie Smith, all part of that Harlem Renaissance scene in these Manhattan jazz clubs in the 20s. The Mafia felt as though they had kind of already marked their territory, so to speak, with a lot of these artists having them played residencies in their nightclubs. And after all, if you were an artist playing in a Mafia-owned nightclub in the 1920s, you might know too much. You might know too much. So when these artists started recording with OK Records or Columbia or any other record label who wanted to capitalize off the jazz age, the Mafia really wasn't going to just let this happen without maintaining some kind of control over the artists and what the artists knew about them, essentially. So the Mafia started to infiltrate the sales channels the record labels were utilizing to distribute their records. They started finding out who the record label was sending their albums to for distribution to the public, and then they'd go after those distributors and use their same old tactics of intimidation, bribery, and other threats to ensure the distributors only sold and distributed to the places the Mafia wanted those albums to be sold. Now you're probably thinking, well, why would the Mafia care where these albums are being sold? Well, simultaneously in the 1920s, along with this emergence and boom of nightclubs, was coming an emergence and boom of jukeboxes. Jukeboxes were becoming a huge staple in nightclubs, and Mafia-controlled jukebox companies would supply these jukebox machines to the Mafia-controlled nightclubs. And with the sales and operation of these jukeboxes, you also had to receive records from distributors so you could play that music in your jukebox, in your club. So with all this popular jazz music, the Mafia wanted to make sure their clubs got those hot off the press albums from Columbia and from OK Records and any other record label that was recording these jazz artists. And it wasn't just that the Mafia had to go out and find the distributor and intimidate them into providing their jukebox companies and their clubs with these records, because in many cases it was actually much easier for the Mafia because the Mafia already had those connections with the artists themselves since they had been playing for them in their clubs. In exchange for the artist agreeing to sell their records exclusively or primarily to the Mafia connection, their song or album would often do much better in the marketplace than an artist who maybe wasn't selling their album via Mafia-controlled channels. And that's because the Mafia was going around to these distributors and intimidating them and threatening them to only distribute widely the records they had these deals on. And they'd also make sure they only had those records in their jukeboxes too. And so that also ensured those artists knew they were the ones getting played at the nightclubs more than a non-Mafia connected artist. Now, this whole concept of the Mafia controlling which albums and songs got out there laid down the roots for what would eventually become known as payola practices. Payola practices didn't come into play until later, once the radio had evolved. And the Mafia was then accused of controlling which songs got radio airplay, again by using the same tactics of intimidation, bribery, blackmail, etc. The same tactics they used on small business owners in Manhattan, on record label distributors, on anybody, political opponents. Now, it's important to emphasize and stress that there are no direct, tangible, black and white recorded ties between OK Records or Columbia Records or any other record label and the Mafia. However, the label's success in promoting jazz and blues artists during the 1920s meant that their records were likely part of the Mafia-controlled jukebox operations and distribution networks. Now, the Mafia's involvement in jukebox operations and record distribution meant that a portion of the profits from record sales likely flowed back to these organized crime gangs. And this created a system where the success of certain records could be tied directly to the Mafia's ability to push them through their own controlled channels. So now, not only is the Mafia supplying illegal alcohol, prostitutes, operating brothels, intimidating political opponents and voters, participating in election fraud to get certain political outcomes, bribing and intimidating judges, but now they are also controlling artist sale distributions and jukebox operations all throughout, primarily, at least for for the 1920s, New York City, and Chicago. So it's only natural for the Mafia that they infiltrate themselves further into the lives and careers of these artists and delve deeper into directly managing these artists and booking them for live performances outside of their own nightclubs. And throughout the 1930s, that's exactly what members of the Mafia did. They started using protection rackets to gain control over bigger, more legitimate music venues. They'd ask these venue owners to pay them a certain lump sum of money, and if they didn't, they threatened to vandalize their venue, set it on fire. They'd threaten violence against the venue owner and their family. Again, the exact same tactics used to get the political voting outcomes that the Democratic Party wanted, and the same tactics used against all of the small business owners and record label distributors in the 1900s in Manhattan. I mean, it's their same wash, rinse, repeat routine. This time they're going after big live music venues for big concerts. And guess what? It worked. It worked every time. It worked for decades, and it was working for these larger performing venues too. Not only did the venue owner have to agree to pay the mob off, but they also had to agree, in many cases, to let frontmen for the Mafia invest in or manage these venues directly. These frontmen would be perfectly clean cut in a suit, look totally legitimate, and they would then own a part of the venue and would operate these venues fully or partially on behalf of the Mafia, while providing this front that they are a completely legitimate businessman. And in return, the Mafia would also get a piece of the pie from the venue's profits. In some cases, the Mafia was nicer to the venue owner and would form a genuine business partnership. They really only did that if they really liked the guy and thought he would be really willing to participate. These partnerships were mutually beneficial. The Mafia provided financial backing and protection and access to alcohol, while the venue owners offered a very legitimate front for the Mafia's activities and allowed them to book whichever artist they wanted to. And which artist the Mafia wanted to book was dependent on several factors. Oftentimes, it was whoever they genuinely thought would draw the biggest crowd. Sometimes it was dependent on who the manager for that artist was and what connections the manager had to the Mafia members owning and controlling that venue. Many times, too, the Mafia would draft up exclusive contracts with the artists. Sometimes the artists wouldn't even have a choice but to sign these contracts. They'd be forced to do so. Or worse, the artist would sign something willingly, not fully reading it and not understanding what they were signing into. The Mafia's involvement in the live venue space really solidified after Prohibition was reversed in 1933. The reversal of Prohibition meant they had to start focusing more and more on legitimate business operations. So not only did they continue to grow and work on their live venue controls, they also got further into talent management in the 1930s. This way, they could cut out the middleman of the artist manager, and everyone was connected and on the same team. Now, of course, it would be cumbersome and slow-moving to target singular artists one at a time, so the Mafia decided they would just start infiltrating talent agencies that had portfolios of artists and managed several of them at a time. They're sitting there thinking, why didn't we do this sooner? It's so obvious. It's so simple. The talent agencies are responsible for everything from A to Z, the managing of the artist, the booking of their performances, their recordings and their appearances, their PR, everything. By gaining control over these talent agencies, the Mafia could influence which artists received opportunities and how much they were paid. The Mafia often used frontmen, again at these talent agencies, to look like legitimate business people, and this allowed them to operate behind the scenes while maintaining a degree of separation. Now, artists managed by Mafia-controlled agencies often found themselves locked into long-term contracts that, at the end of the day, really did nothing but exploit them. These contracts typically favored the management company, with artists receiving only a small portion of their earnings. The Mafia would take a significant cut of their profits, often leaving the artist with very little financial gain. Any artist who resisted signing these contracts or who attempted to break free from them faced intimidation, threats, and even violence. The Mafia used its reputation for ruthlessness to ensure compliance, leaving artists with few options but to accept the terms. The Mafia's influence extended to record labels and recording studios in the 1940s. This way, they could continue to grow their control over the production and distribution of an artist's work. This allowed them to manipulate the success of artists they managed by ensuring that their record received airplay and distribution, often in exchange for a share of profits. Enter those payola practices I mentioned a few minutes ago, the practice of paying for radio airplay. And this became more and more prevalent in the 1940s and 1950s, all the way up arguably until recent days. Throughout the 1940s, they maintained their control over nightclubs as well. And despite the exploitative nature of these relationships, the Mafia's involvement in artist management contributed to the success of many prominent artists, most notably from the 1940s being Frank Sinatra. Now, through the 40s and 50s, these operations did nothing but continue to grow. The Mafia often used the music industry as a means to launder other money from other illegal activities, including gambling and trafficking, and extortion. Record labels, management companies, and concert promotions provided a legitimate front for these operations, as it was ambiguous and primarily cash-based, and still is. But as all of this started to grow and become a bigger and bigger interconnected web, many would argue that the Mafia started to get a little sloppy in their operations. And artists and band members started to pick up on the dirty dealings of the industry. This became more and more robust in the 60s, especially with the mysterious deaths of Jimi Hendrix and Kurt Cobain. But you also have the deaths of Bobby Fuller, Johnny Ace, Sam Cooke, Tommy James, and all of Phil Spector's associates, and possibly Elvis. Now, while the Mafia's influence on the music industry was notably significant during the 19th and 20th centuries, people are still curious about how an organization so deeply rooted in an industry could diminish in the 21st century. Many argue that the fact the music industry today is dominated by major corporations, digital streaming platforms, and a highly regulated legal framework, that it makes it more challenging for traditional organized crime groups to have that same level of involvement. But has the Mafia merely simplified themselves and pivoted from organized crime to a network of intimidating business moguls? Of course, there are still isolated reports and allegations of criminal elements attempting to exploit parts of the industry, particularly in areas like concert promotion or artist management, but many argue that these instances are rare and don't seem to reflect the widespread influence the Mafia once had, unless that influence has simply changed and is now camouflaged as something more legitimate, possibly, arguably, into operations that, while technically legal, still mirror the core values of the old school mob. Most recently, this topic obviously came up with the Live Nation and Ticketmaster merger, the man behind it all being Irving Azoff. If you have not seen my episode on Irving Azoff, I will link it at the end of this video and in the description down below. So I'm curious what you think. Do you think that the Mafia still exists and controls the music industry, albeit possibly under a different camouflage, under a suit and a tie? Now that we know the Mafia valued its frontmen, let me know in the comments down below, what do you think? And if you like this type of content, don't forget to hit the thumbs up button and subscribe to the channel. You can also give me a super thanks. A super thanks is a button at the bottom of the play bar that allows you to donate any amount of money that you would like to the channel, and you can help directly with the research by buying me a coffee. The Buy Me a Coffee link is also in the description down below. And of course, I will see you on the next Roots Rockumentary.
Hungry for the road all my life, thirsty for adventure all my youth, chasing all my freedoms down Liberty Avenue.